And here we are. We are live. I'm David. This is Unbound Productions, and we're chatting with, she's that way, Leslie Higgins. How's it going? How's your day going today?
I'm good, doing well.
That's good. So let's. We were chatting a little bit before we started this because we don't just launch into this live. Um, how do we? You are a little bit different from the artists that we've talked with here on Unbowed before, but you're an incredible musician. So how would you describe yourself?
Oh my. Well, I would describe myself as I'm a classical musician. I studied classical voice in my undergrad, and I just finished a graduate degree, my master's at the University of Toronto in classical voice performance. So when I'm chatting with someone who doesn't know anything about classical music, I basically say that I'm an opera singer. But I don't necessarily think I would define myself as an opera singer just because that seems very, I don't know, high tier. But opera is what I study.
Okay,
Yes.
perfect. And I think that you launched into one of the things I really want to talk to you about, and I think that a lot of people need to hear, and that is the alternative ways into music. Mostly when people say, you're a musician, the first things that start coming is, oh, what genre are you in? When you're releasing an album, what's your recording process, that sort of stuff. Whereas you're the other route.
Yes.
And we can think of it as staged performances. So let's talk about how you got into music first. Like
Hmm.
right at the beginning, what got you into music? What got you into this?
Yeah. For me, I was a very energetic kid. I always danced and sang around the house. So my mom was immediately like, "Oh, we need to get her doing something musical." And I grew up in a small town. I grew up in Uxbridge, Ontario, and my hometown has a phenomenal arts community, and it's definitely a massive reason why where I am today. Which is interesting because my family is not musical at all. No one in my family is nearly as musically inclined as I am. My grandmother is a phenomenal pianist, but that's it. So
Okay.
I'm the rare gem. But there was a youth choir that was starting in my hometown that my mom heard about, so she immediately signed me up. So I started singing in choir when I was in grade 1, and then I started taking private voice and piano lessons a little bit later when I would have been in grade like 3, 4. And I also started doing musical theater in my hometown, also quite young. My first production was Annie, and I was in grade 2. And then I did a show pretty much every year, if not multiple shows a year, up until I left my hometown when I graduated high school. Yeah.
So I have to ask, who were you in your first performance?
Well, I was just a little orphan. In fact, I was a special add-in because my older brother also did a lot of theater, and he was not nearly as musically inclined as me. He wasn't the greatest singer, but he was very charismatic, loved to be on stage. So all the directors knew my older brother. So here was his like cute little sister, and they were like, "Okay, you can come in a year early." I was a year younger than all the other kids,
Okay.
but my first actual line was the next year we did Fiddler on the Roof.
Mm.
And I had a line. I was Yussel the hat seller. And I had one little line like, "Would you like to buy the hat, sir?" That was my big debut.
I think
But
that's funny. I think my first real musical theater performance was Fiddler on the Roof. So
really,
yeah,
yeah.
lots of memories on that one.
Uh-huh.
It is a production and a half.
Oh, yeah.
So once you started getting, like, once you figured out this is what you wanted to do, and the
Hmm.
musical theater aspect of it, the opera aspect of it, where did you go from there? How did you grow, develop, find your, like choose your path?
Yeah. I mean, I think a lot of my path was influenced by seeing things that older students did around me. So I studied with a wonderful teacher in my hometown, Jennifer Nevieux, and um, of course there was a lot of like students that were older than me that I saw the path that they went on and the ones who chose to pursue music after high school. So I definitely knew about that path pretty young, and I was pretty, music was my thing. I loved it, so I was pretty confident that that's what I wanted to do, even though I didn't necessarily know what that would look like. And I mean, in terms of opera specifically, I don't even think that was a part of my lens until I actually got to my undergrad. Um, and it's interesting because with music, when you come at it from the the education route, if you follow the conservatory, so for me that would have been the Royal Conservatory, then as you work your way up in the grades, the higher you get, it's basically training you into classical music. Like that's kind of the trajectory. It's the same for all other instruments. For piano, in grades 1 and 2, you might be playing like cute little ditties, but by the time you get to the higher grades, you're playing, Chopin, Bach, all the main classical standard composers.
Mhm.
And of course, then you also have to do all the extra exams, being theory, history, all that stuff, which leads you towards the kind of classes you'd be taking in an undergraduate degree for music. Um, so yeah, for me, I loved all of that stuff. So it was easy for me to know that I wanted to continue studying music beyond. Another big influence for me was when I was in grade 11, I auditioned to sing with the Ontario Youth Choir. And I sang with them for 4 consecutive summers. OYC is a summer program that happens for about 10 days in August. And it's just a bunch of kids across Ontario between like end of high school, grade 11, 12, up until usually fourth year university. Um, and you just get together for 10 days. There's a different conductor that they pull from the Ontario choral community every year. And you just have a really intensive, like 10 days of singing choral music all day long, like literally rehearsals from 9 a.m. until 9 p.m. And then you do a little tour at the end of the week. You go perform in 3 cities. We always end in Toronto. And yeah, and I like loved it. It's actually funny. My very first year singing with OIC, I actually got laryngitis on the first day of camp and I lost my voice and I could not sing a note. Okay. So I just had to sit in these rehearsals for like 12-hour days of just choral music. And it just completely spoke to my soul. I couldn't even participate in the music making, but seeing all and getting to experience meeting all of these other kids who were as passionate as I was about classical music was just so
Mhm.
enriching. And I was dead from then on. I was like, this is my path. It's easy.
So,
But
and then
yeah.
from there, you did an undergraduate in music,
Yes.
and
Yeah.
what specifically did you do?
Well, at I went to Western, and at Western you don't have to define your major usually until third year. So I was pretty sure that I wanted to do performance. Um, well, actually, I guess going into it from high school, I was thinking I wanted to do music ed. But once I got there and saw that I loved the performing parts of it, then it was pretty easy for me to want to audition for the performance program, which is what I did. So I was a graduate of my undergrad in voice performance at Western.
Mhm.
Yeah, but I did still take the ed classes when I could. Like I took music education in first year. I took all the choral conducting classes, which I really loved. Yeah, which I guess is the nice thing about um, at least Western's undergrad is that it's pretty open for you to be able to take electives from the other
Mhm.
streams. Um, yeah. And of course, having that common year at the beginning kind of puts everyone in the same little bubble. Whereas other degrees, like the University of Toronto's undergrad, for example, you choose your major right out of the gate.
Mhm.
So there, a lot of the performance students don't necessarily mingle with the education students. So there's a bit more of a divide there.
Mhm.
Um, so I was grateful to have chosen Western. I loved my experience there at the Faculty of Music. But yeah.
So, how did, or let's phrase it this way, what was the
Mhm.
benefit of doing that bachelor in music for you and for people who are considering a career in music?
Yeah. I mean, I think a big one would be connections. I mean, having the opportunity to work on your voice, I mean, as a singer, is my perspective. But for any of the instrumentalists, you get a huge part of the program is that you get private lessons with a professor who teaches at the institution. And of course, as a classical musician and growing up doing private lessons my whole life, that was always my trajectory. So yeah, having one-on-one work, usually you would have an hour lesson every week with your professor, is huge. It allows you to build a phenomenal relationship with someone on staff who is much your senior, usually, at least in the classical world, all of the professors are, or at least were, professional musicians. So they're coming from a very diverse, experienced background that they give to their students. Um, yeah, so I think that is, yeah, a really phenomenal part of these programs. And also just the opportunity to meet so many other musicians, colleagues, making friends, people that you have a shared connection with right out of the gate.
Hmm.
Because like I mentioned, in I grew up in a pretty small town, and I was, even though I had a lot of peers that did, music with me, I was one of the few that was really, really passionate about it. So coming, like what I mentioned with the Ontario Youth Choir and going into an undergrad in music and being surrounded by people that had similar backgrounds to me was like so different from anything I had experienced and so just phenomenal. Being able to meet people that I could automatically connect to. They thought the way I did.
Well, and surrounding yourself with people who are as passionate about it. It doesn't have to be with the same instrument. It doesn't have to be voice. So, like,
Yeah.
any of the music components, anybody who's passionate about the same thing that you are is going to help you
Yeah.
grow as a person.
Absolutely.
And I think that there are misconceptions, particularly when we start getting into it. Like when you talk about opera and stuff like that, most people, younger people, yeah, maybe not the best idea, um, are thinking about sort of the three tenors, or like that one soloist up front on stage. But to make a musical production, be it opera or whatever, you have to collaborate with the other vocalists, and particularly when you're talking about like choral and choir and things, like you can't
Mhm.
be your own, like you can't just go off in your own direction when you're doing it.
Yeah, it's very collaborative for sure. Yeah.
So before we get into some other things that you're touching on, I just want to sort of finish it off in that you just did your masters. um
Mhm.
what prompted you to go into the masters, and how is it different from the undergrad?
Um, okay, well, I'll start with the first half. I um okay, well, this is something that we can touch into a bit later, but when it comes to classical music, or at least a career in classical voice, then there's really not much you can do with an undergrad. um for A lot of people actually don't know this, or at least people who aren't in the classical sphere, but most professional singers, classical singers, aren't your voices isn't really fully developed until mid 30s. So it's quite a different career length, or like placement in the lifespan, than a lot of other performing
Hmm.
arts is, in that it really doesn't start to settle until you're a little bit older. So because of that, there's kind of this never-ending uphill climb for young classical
Hmm.
singers, because you're just constantly building your technique, learning, like continually learning new repertoire, which continually changes as your voice develops
Hmm.
more in terms of where your voice sits within the sphere of music. And yeah, anyways, so when I finished my undergrad, I knew that I loved everything that I'd learned there, and I wanted to continue
Hmm.
learning and singing. So I chose to do that through a master's degree, which is quite common for those who want to continue on the trajectory of
Hmm.
performance. Um, yeah, and I chose to keep it relatively small. I considered auditioning at schools in the States. In hindsight now, I'm really glad that I didn't, just because of, the pandemic, everything that has happened since. But I just auditioned for U of T and McGill, and I ended up choosing the University of Toronto. Um, yeah, another big part of it is, especially as you get to these higher levels of education, leaving undergrad, is choosing who you're going to be studying with. That's a huge part. So for me, um, like picking and choosing, doing trial lessons with people on the faculty at both U of T and McGill was a big process for me for the fourth year of my undergrad. And yeah, so my professor, who I'm currently studying with, Nathalie Paulin, she was a huge factor for me coming to
Hmm.
Toronto. Um, yeah, in terms of the differences between master's and undergrad, I mean, it's really just a lot more focused, in that in your undergrad you're getting a much more diverse, well-rounded education, and that you're in music, at least, you're taking a lot of other types of music courses. You're doing skills classes, history, theory, all of the laying the foundation for being a well-rounded artist, we say, but a well-rounded artist in, classical music, European, Eurocentric music. Um, and then the master's degree is much more focused with your specialty. So for me, that was classical voice. So most of my courses were just singing, yeah, art song, leader classes, different with working with collaborative pianists, and then of course my lessons and coachings with my accompanist. Yeah, and then working towards recitals.
That's
So.
cool. And the
Mm,
first thing I was going to say is that sounds like a lot of work, and I think that that's actually something I want to touch on because
sure.
there is a misconception that if you're talented, it's just going to happen. And anybody who's heard you saying there's absolutely no denying that there's talent there, but you're looking at what even just as a post secondary education, a minimum of 6 years you've put into this, and prior to that, those vocal lessons, you're looking at more than half of your life just hammering on and
Mhm.
honing this technique. How important is it for people to understand that talent is only going to get you so far?
Very, very important. I mean, um, there are definitely elements to our art that are, well, this is I did a vocal pedagogy class with Torrent Childs and at Western, and he always talked about the untrainable elements of our art, which is the charisma that a performer has, what they bring to the stage, their ability to communicate things to an audience that element that's not quite as teachable. But if we're talking about just the straight skills of using your
Mm-hmm.
instrument, then yeah, I mean, I'm of the belief that everybody can sing, and if you work on it and learn how to use your resonance and your instrument in different ways, then you can, everyone can improve. But definitely, there's a certain element that some people are more naturally inclined to find different sounds than others, being that talent. But yeah, you can forever work on developing your instrument. It's honestly, developing technique never ends. I don't think for a singer you will ever hit a point where you're like, I've mastered this. Just because for singing, it's a part of our body, right? Every day is different depending on what you've eaten that day, how much sleep you've gotten. Every single thing that you do impacts how your voice
Mm-hmm.
reacts. So because of that, even if you're, perfectly trained, then you're never going to know 100% how you're going to use your voice in that moment.
And wow, you hit on something incredibly important, particularly for vocalists. But I think that just about any musician needs to understand, not just musicians, technicians, everything, that everything that's going on affects the performance, and they are mowing the lawn.
Yeah. Yeah.
Just give it a second. This guy has made 4 passes already. I've been trying to mute it
Seriously?
out every time. Um,
Going for a clean cut.
yeah, the joys of urban living. All right. Um, so what I was saying was that your environment and understanding not just the natural talent. If you're a technician or a producer, you might have a really good ear, but how the sound changes in the environment that you're working in, how to work with those things as a vocalist, how you
Mm.
slept last night, let alone everything else,
Yep.
dramatically changes. And you don't necessarily have to go through a formal education process, but getting the training to understand your instrument, I think, is a huge.
Yep. Yep. And also understanding vocal hygiene, knowing how to take care of it is huge, you know? And there's a lot of like buzzword things that people will throw around, but there's also a lot of myths, a lot of things people think are good or bad for the voice that are, complete either wrong or just very dependent on every person's individual body, right? I think that's the crazy thing I've learned about the voice is that you really can't have one be all like understanding of how the voice works because every single body is different every person's instrument, the way that it aligns in their own shape, their head shape, their entire body, everything, it makes it different. So how one person feels one sensation could be entirely different from how you feel it. So yeah, you're good.
Little frustrating.
Hmm.
Just because it ruins the flow, and there's something I really want to launch into that. I'm just waiting for him to leave. Um,
Yep.
maybe. So I'll so the where we go from there is simply the question I have for that when you're talking about hygiene and all the myths and things like that. I think that we can start to talk about authenticity and building your own voice, and we'll start off with, you say that there's a bunch of myths and things going on around it. How do you figure out your own, how do you figure out what's right for you? Because this is what starts to develop your own identity. So,
Yeah.
some things that work for you won't work for me, won't work for somebody else, but people are going to tell you, oh, you should do this or do that. How did you and how do you figure out your own way?
Yeah, it's a great question. And it's I mean, I think for me personally, and what I would recommend to any musician, singer, would be experimentation. You're only going to know if something doesn't work if you try it and it doesn't work, or vice versa. You're only going to find something if you just like mess around and, explore your
Mm-hmm.
voice, take it to its limits and like play with different things. Of course, you don't necessarily have to do that on stage when you're performing, but there's so much opportunity to just explore. And I think this is a really great thing that I'll add here is that for me personally, and I know for a lot of people who have had a more formal education in singing or in music, there can be a big there can be a lot of discouragement towards exploration and towards using your voice in different
Mm-hmm.
ways. And it's really frustrating because I feel like this is also a personality type, but some people have a lot of like a lack of confidence in their own abilities. You feel like you need to be told how to do something by someone who's higher up or above you, whatever. Which of course can be really, you can learn a lot from mentors and from people above you and other people giving you advice, but you're really only gonna get to know your own instrument by taking everything people say with a grain of salt, playing with it, taking what works, taking what doesn't work, learning from all of it, and building your own specific package, what works for
Mm-hmm.
you. Um, yeah. And I think that's really important, especially for young musicians who are taking the more standardized, like lesson approach to learn, is that your teacher isn't a deity who knows everything about your instrument. In fact, very much not. They know everything about their instrument and
Mm-hmm.
they're giving you all of the advice from what they've learned, also from what they've learned from teaching, a multitude of other singers. Um, and they're giving you all that information, and you have to learn to take that and apply what works and just throw away what doesn't. And there's nothing wrong with that. That's very
No, and
important.
it's what we're talking about now is that developing your own sense of self,
Yeah.
who you are, and it's really weird when it comes to musicians because there has to be a level of ego to sit there and go, I am good enough to get on stage and do this. But at the same time, every musician I know, they want that, for lack of a better word, external validation. If you're working with professors, you want them to say you're good by doing this. But in
Hmm.
some ways, that discourages finding your own voice. Because if you're just
Yeah.
constantly seeking the validation, you're never going to become yourself. So,
Yeah.
for you, how did you develop Leslie?
I mean, it was that was definitely something that I really struggle with. In fact, something I think I still struggle with is this kind of constant debate of how much of my art or how much of my joy for what I'm doing comes from that external validation. How much of it is from, wanting to impress people and wanting to show people, look how far I've made it. Look at this wasn't a mistake entering music. Look at how much I've achieved. Look at how good I've
Mm-hmm.
become. I don't think it's shameful to think those things because I know, I'm not alone in thinking those things. That's a huge part of this
Mm-hmm.
industry. And it's really hard to, grapple with those thoughts because like you said, you feel really egotistical caring about that kind of stuff. Um, so it's been really hard for me to kind of separate that and to find my own, personal joy for
Mm-hmm.
it. Um, and it's actually interesting because I really think that the pandemic, these last 2 years, have actually kind of forced a lot of people to face that because we haven't really had as much opportunity to be constantly out getting this external validation for people because so much of what we've been doing has kind of been put on
Mm-hmm.
pause and we've been reflecting in our own spaces on our own with our own instruments being like, so what are we now that we don't have an audience, that we don't have people who we're singing for? What's
Mm-hmm.
left? So yeah, I actually think a lot of my personal growth in that way has really, really developed a lot over these last 2 years. Also through doing my master's, having just a lot more freedom than in my undergrad, which was a lot more
Mm-hmm.
streamlined. Um, yeah, but I really think for me it's just come from time, letting all that settle, sitting with my instrument, with my, having different opportunities, just letting everything settle and not feeling like you need to define your identity right
Mm-hmm.
away. So much it just comes from, a lot like long time building trust in
Mm-hmm.
yourself, all that kind of stuff.
And I'm going to switch gears. Not really. We're going to stay within the same framework, but we're going to talk about, because what you're doing, you're not making your own music. You're not writing your own songs. You're not going into a recording studio. What you're doing is that performance aspect, musical theater, opera, that sort of stuff. And
Mhm.
in some ways, it's a little bit more regulated. I'm not sure if that's the right word, in that you have a character that you have to portray, and there are certain things that are expected of it. And you have a director that you're working with. But at the same time, you're not a blank slate. You have to bring something to it. So how do you balance that? Yeah, that's a hard one.
uh, yeah, no, it's a good question, and it's one that I love to ask people above me too. I think it's a this question of how an artist, how especially, in this more classical education driven
Mm-hmm.
world where we're taught all of these things. And I will add here, I think as much as when you're actually at the performing stage where you're working with a director or a music director and you're working to combat their opinions about something, that's a little bit different. I'll talk more about being loyal to a
Mm-hmm.
composer and taking someone else's creation and, you know juggling with your interpretations on the work and the, historical, like political, all of these extra things that come with this work of art that was created,
Mm-hmm.
perhaps 300 years ago, and years of learned traditions about this style of music, and, yeah, finding a way to make it your own piece of art as opposed to just exactly following what's on the
Mm-hmm.
page. And it's complicated because we are trained, especially in an undergrad. I think a lot of people struggle with this in undergrad, because we're really trained to. What's happening with my
You're
thing
just
here?
lagging a little bit. It's okay. Your audio is coming through fine.
Okay, sure. Um, we're trained very much to stay to the book, and it's I think a big flaw in a lot of undergraduate music programs is that they don't really encourage finding your individual artistry, which sucks. I think we need more of that. And as you get further up in, in studying, you get a little bit more liberty. Like in my master's, I had a lot more freedom to explore my own,
Mm-hmm.
identity. Um, but yeah, it's hard. And but it's also kind of exciting in some ways because I think a lot of people think that you can't find as much personal artistry in performing someone else's work. But I think that you can, because there isn't really a learned, in the way it's performed, tradition of the repertoire. In that you don't, if you're learning if you're doing a cover of a pop
Hmm.
song, then you have that artist's, piece that's influencing how you sing. So I'm also a teacher, and a lot of my younger students, if they come to me and they want to sing, Sia or Lady Gaga, then so often they'll just completely copy that artist's vocal style, and they throw, whatever personal style they sing with, they throw all that out the window and they just exactly copy. Sia is a great example because she's such a unique
Hmm.
sound, and they'll just copy how she sings and all of these weird like glottal onsets and stuff that she does. And I'm like, that's great. You can learn a lot from that. But, what if you tried to sing it like you? What if you tried to bring your own personality to it? So for classical music, because these pieces have been sung so many times by so many different musicians, then there's a little bit more freedom to put it into your own voice and to find it in your own instrument. Um, yeah, I think it's a little bit harder, but to find your own artistry, bring your own flair to it. But I think there's a lot of exciting ways that you can do that. And like you mentioned, David, when you're doing auditions, you really have to because you've got to stand out. You can't sound like every other soprano singing Dave Yenny. You have to bring your own spin to it. You have to be you. You have to be authentic. So
And I'm glad you touched on it. I'm a huge fan of cover songs if they're done well. Um,
yeah,
but so many people, so many artists out there, and I think with the new YouTube landscape and things like that, where they're able to put this stuff out, they're karaoke covers. There's
yeah,
there's there's no
exactly.
difference. There's no innovation. But the ones that stick with you, the ones that hit in your head, if you're going to be old school like me, things like Ring of Fire by Johnny Cash is actually a cover, but his is the only version. And then you move forward to Hurt by Johnny Cash, which is a Nine Inch Nails song. And how he
Yeah.
changed that. The one that always when I'm trying to explain how to make it completely and totally different stand out, there's a 99 Problems by Jay-Z. There's a partial cover of it by a group called Hugo, and it's
Right.
bluegrass,
That's so
right?
cool. Yeah.
But you talk. These are songs with and well, Jay Z is in some ways regarded as untouchable and things like that. When we're talking about classical music, when we're talking about opera, when we're talking about songs that are 300-400 years old, I've always gotten the impression that in some ways some people see them as sacrosanct, that you can't touch the master, and
A lot of people do. Oh yeah. It's huge.
so how
Uh-huh.
how did you? Because I've heard you do it. I mean, seen it, but that's not the point. It's the hearing. How did you get over that? And what was the pushback you got when you did something unique or different?
Yeah. Um, I think for me, at some point, I just learned that you you have to. I mean, that was my constant question was, how do you ever reach the point where you feel confident or knowledgeable enough about this work of art to feel that you can bring your own interpretation to it? Because I think for me, going through education, a big part of that was ego. I never felt like I was good enough as a musician or educated enough to be able to. Oops.
Somebody wants to say hi.
And we're back. Good, 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 good. I'll just continue. I never felt that um, or I always questioned whether I was good enough or educated enough to be able to bring my own interpretation to it. Like I felt like it was wrong of me to want to interpret something differently than how everyone else had. Um, so I think, again, that just took time and building my own confidence and trust in myself and my own ideas and
Mm-hmm.
opinions. And also having mentors and peers that, didn't shame me for
Mm.
it, that encouraged me to it, which unfortunately in the classical world was few and far between, harder to find. But those that did are, I think definitely helped shape that in me. And I think that that should be a goal for any
Mm.
musician, but especially, those who are performing works that have been written by someone else. At some point, you have to be able to acknowledge, appreciate everything that they have created for you, but put it into your own system, make it your own when you perform it.
Exactly. And that comes down to I have this big note in my big thing in my notes that just has authenticity with a couple of exclamation
Yeah.
marks and being true to yourself. And I think that while you're not going down the pop genre or that sort of stuff, that necessity to be true to yourself is almost
Yeah.
universal in music, but is probably one of the hardest things to find. And not just music, as an actor, as anybody who needs to find their voice in what they're doing,
Yep.
finding that authenticity. But you touched on it that the vast majority of people are going to be negative. And
Hmm.
not to play up to your ego too much, but that's what we're talking about. You are an authentic person and you have found it. How what does it feel like now that you have that confidence in yourself, and how, because what I'm trying to get at is you touched on it that you initially start to feel, well, I'm not good enough, but you have those ideas, you have those thoughts of I could do this, but there's that nagging voice in the back of your head that says no, you can't, you're not there yet.
Yeah.
But now you're there, and how do you differentiate, because I know you still get those voices, we all do.
Uh-huh.
So how do you differentiate? How do you trust yourself? What does it feel like? If you can answer, if you can't, I mean.
Yeah, I mean, I think for me, a big part of my work is personal learning. When I have new repertoire, then there's a lot of learning that happens before I perform
Mm.
it. So that's a lot of time that I have to sit with the music, sit with it in my own voice, sit with the poetry, sit with the everything that's on the page. And I think for me, I usually um I do a bit of both. I think it's still very important when you're performing historical music or any music that isn't your own to do the
Mm.
research, to know, understand the composer, understand why it was written, understand the context, all of the things that you can know about the piece to allow that to influence your interpretation of it. I think that's still really important. So I do that background work, and then I just sit with the music on its own, and I let it influence me. And then yeah, I think for me it's really just time, having time with a piece, um, and letting it sit in my voice, and the words sit in my mind, and percolate with all these ideas. And also just performing. I mean, for me, I like to think I'm quite a more of a relatively spontaneous performer, which is ironic because I am not a spontaneous person in real life. But when it comes to performing, a lot of things happen for me on stage that never happen in the practice room. So with that too, there's a lot that I learn about this music just by performing it, singing it for other people. And so a lot of my own interpretation of it just comes from doing that, from seeing what happens, from trying different things with the piece, seeing what I like, what I don't like, what works, what doesn't work, etc.
I think that you hit on a major thing that I didn't even think about, but that is incredibly important for a lot of artists, particularly as we move into this new media environment where
Yeah.
you can sit here very much as we are right now with a home studio, which is a laptop and a small soundboard and whatever, and you can just start hammering stuff out. And there's
Hmm.
this feeling, this need to do it as quickly as possible, to hammer it out, get it out there, get eyes on you. But what you're talking about is taking that time to really work with the music, to look to get the music, to take the time, you know.
Yeah.
And I would suggest, and from what you're saying, and just to expand on it a little bit, the ability to not just sit in the music, but to walk away from it for a little bit and come back
Huge.
to it.
Yeah. Absolutely.
So that is an incredibly important thing. Thank you for hitting on that, because I think so many people just
Hmm.
really want to just like, I made a song, I want to get it out there, it's perfect, you know. I'm
Yep.
seeing on some forums and stuff. Well, I just wrote this little piece. What do you all think about it? It's like, well, did you write it like 5 minutes ago? Because that's sort of what it feels like, and that's not necessarily a bad thing. But
Yep.
you know, how can you be happy with it when it's barely existed? So,
Yep. Yep.
um, oh no,
I
please.
if I can, I will add to this that I think there's a really important line here too between, what you're talking about, having time to sit with something versus just feeling this constant pressure to go, 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 release, release,
Hmm.
release. But on top of that, you want to be careful to not push too far on the waiting if the issues are perfectionism, because that's, yeah, you don't you're never going to create a perfect piece of art, and at some point you have to be comfortable just letting something live as it is and not constantly trying to make it better. So there is a
Hmm.
line, I think, and I think for classical music musicians, especially over the last 2 years, with everything shifting online, and because we've had to create a lot more like studio type content, then we've been faced to figure that out a lot more, because we're used to, we go on stage, we perform, one done,
Hmm.
that's it. Whereas now we're doing recordings and we're sitting with our art and we're like, this sucks. I don't like this. So we do it. We keep recording 50 times and then our voice is tired and everything gets
Hmm.
worse. So yeah, it's hard to also quiet that perfectionist voice inside. So I think it's definitely a juggle in
Oh,
that
oh,
regard.
definitely. When we start talking about, you know, the difference between taking the time to make it right versus honing in on every single note and everything, there's two things that always come to my
Yeah.
mind. One was George Lucas said that projects are never finished, just abandoned. There has,
Right, for
which
sure.
is really weird for a guy who always went back to stuff and fixed it and tinkered with it.
Yeah.
But the other one is, do you know Guns N' Roses?
Yeah.
Roughly.
Yeah.
Their last album
Yeah.
was called Chinese Democracy. It took
Hmm.
10 years to release because Axl Rose is an absolute perfectionist. And the problem is, if you listen to the album, I can't tell you if it's good or bad. What I can tell you is it is so horribly overproduced that, you know,
Exactly.
I can't get into it, let alone, you
Yeah.
know. So, yeah, 100%. You know, there is that fine line.
That's why stepping away is
Mm-hmm.
huge, because you get so wrapped up in this bubble that you're so tunnel vision, you lose perspective. So taking time away is very enlightening in that regard.
So, you touched on it. We're going to switch gears just a little bit and we're going to head
Yeah.
into COVID and
Yeah.
how it affected you and let's start off on the easy part, which is how it affected your
Mhm.
education, because you managed to graduate your undergrad prior to.
Yep. Well, right during,
Oh,
but yeah.
okay.
Yeah.
So please, how did it
Yeah,
go?
yeah. Well, COVID first when it hit, what was that, March, during my
Hmm.
fourth year. So I didn't really finish it. It's so funny. People always talk about like it's just like this void. We've just lost all this time. Part of me still feels like I have to finish my undergrad because it doesn't feel like I actually did. But yeah, so everything was canceled at the end of my fourth year. And yeah, thankfully we still all graduated, which was
Hmm.
great. Um, and then, yeah, I moved to Toronto to start my master's. And I have now done 2 years of a master's program during the
Hmm.
pandemic, which is, again, crazy. It doesn't really feel like I've done school, but alas, I've graduated again. So, okay. Um, yeah. And I mean, different layers. Moving to Toronto during the pandemic was definitely isolating. I live alone.
Hmm.
So, certainly very isolating being in a new city, going to a new school. Especially U of T is a very like a lot of people in my program did their undergrads at U of T, so there was definitely a little bubble of people knowing each other already, and trying to meet people on when you're on Zoom. It was like, hey, like I'm Leslie, I went to Western, nice to meet you. Definitely a little bit more challenging that way, but um, yeah, my first year of my master's was pretty much completely online, with the exception of one course, which was a little hybrid. And then this past year was pretty much entirely back in person, aside from that little stint we had in after Christmas where everything shut down
Hmm.
again. Um, yeah, so um, I mean that's the easy part. Do you want to ask another question, or do you want me to? to dig
No,
into them.
I'd like to dig into it because I
Yeah.
think that, despite the fact that things are opening up a little bit more and stuff, this has completely changed the landscape. And there is an
Hmm.
entire generation of not just music students, but of performers as a whole who that's a great way to put it. There's just this void,
Yeah.
before I really let you get into it, talking with my friends who are musicians and stuff, everybody right at the beginning of the panel was like, oh, just do live streams, just do that stuff. And you touched on it about, you guys going into the studio to record things as opposed to performing live. It is a completely different beast. If you're a
Oh,
touring band, if you're on stage, you've got that audience participation and that energy. If you're live streaming, there is a camera in front of you and that is it.
yeah.
And there is
Yeah.
an entire generation coming through that their formative parts were in this void.
Mhm.
So yeah, please dig into it.
Yeah, yeah, and I think I mentioned before that uh, a bit more of a spontaneous performer, but I think a big part of that comes from the fact that, and I'm definitely not alone in this, but so much of uh, performing comes from the audience, comes from that energy that you get when there's people in the room. You're feeding off their energy. You're seeing them reacting to what you're giving them, and that just all of that just adds so much to how you perform. And yeah, all of that's gone. So what I kind of mentioned earlier with having feeling really isolating in terms of it's just you and your art, and you've lost that third component, which is a huge part of how and
Mm-hmm.
why the reason why we create is for to share it. So um, yeah, really hard. I think I'm a very optimistic person. I always look for the silver linings. So I think for me, it was a big part of that journey was actually really great. It was really cool to be able to kind of slow down
Mm-hmm.
and to sit with what my art, what I'm creating, what I want to create, and really reflect on what I had created and, all that. I think that was really important for me. Um, yeah, I'll touch on another thing for um, okay, well, for classical singers specifically, a big part of our art is we sing without any extra, like we don't sing with mics or anything like that. It's solely our own
Mm-hmm.
acoustics. So because of that, no longer having uh, larger spaces to sing in was pretty
Mm-hmm.
huge. Most of us were singing from our really small apartments. And oh my goodness, if I can say that the acoustics of your instrument change when you are singing in an apartment and you know that your neighbors can hear you and are potentially doing important things and you're conscious, oh my goodness, completely changes how you sing. And it's damaging. Like I know for me, there's a lot of vocal tendencies and habits and bad habits that I've built over the last 2 years that I now need to break down because I'm finally back in bigger spaces again and I'm more comfortable playing with my acoustics. For me, that was tentativeness. Especially in my higher range, I pull back a lot more
Mm,
than I used to. And I don't want to pull back. You got to send, send,
yeah.
send, send. So that's been a big one. And I mean, for me, because this time happened at the end of an undergrad, and I'd already built up a lot of confidence with my own instrument and confidence that I can work on it on my own. Then I was a little bit more comfortable acknowledging and working through those things. But for a lot of younger singers, people just starting undergrads or whatever, oh my goodness, I can't even imagine navigating a lot of that
Mm-hmm.
growth, literal vocal development through those like that more
Mm-hmm.
like post-teen stage of your life in an isolated space where you can only connect with a mentor or a professor through Zoom.
Well, and
And that's a whole other part. Peaking, mics,
oh,
all these things that we've never had to worry about at all. Oh my goodness. The technology side has been a
I was gonna
journey.
say going from what's the name of it, Von Kuster? No, that doesn't sound right. Yeah,
VKH. Yep, yep. Von Keister Hall and yeah, Western.
the
Yeah.
acoustics in that building are amazing, and you can
Yeah.
stand. I know there's that sweet spot right on that stage where you can stand, and the sound that comes out is absolutely amazing,
Yeah.
and you
Very
don't have to pull back at all. As a matter of fact, I'm
nope.
sure they're
Nope.
encouraging you to go, as full throttle as you can,
Uh-huh.
and to switch from that to a room where it's there's really weird echoes and dead spots and everything, and
Oh
then you're
yeah.
going to filter it through a laptop mic, you know?
Yeah.
Like,
Yep. Yikes.
so for the people coming through, it might not be them, it might be the complete situation. And
Absolutely.
and
Yep.
when we're talking about confidence, I think that that needs to come through. But let's flip it around the other way as well. So for the past 2 years, you've been in a box with weird dead spaces and stuff, and you're concerned about your neighbors and stuff like that. As a quick
Mhm.
aside, one of we have some music students who live in the area, and they play the trumpet, and I get
Yeah.
to hear them every once in a while just playing off their balcony because that's how they feel that they're not disturbing anybody.
Right.
Now that you're transitioning back into the big spaces, the where you have that amazing sound, it changes how you sound and how you've been singing. How have you been adjusting to the return to the good acoustic spaces?
Yeah. It's a bit of a balance between um I think because of acknowledging this tendency to want to constantly be quieter, pull back.
Mm-hmm.
Um all of a sudden when you're in a bigger space and you have all this sound that you'd forgotten about, then you want to
Mm-hmm.
give, and there's a line there. um I think and that's the struggle of not singing in bigger acoustics, is that the magic of larger spaces is that so much of that space um like carries your sound more than you need to. If anything, when you're in a larger space that has great acoustics, you can honestly give a little bit less because your sound will
Mm-hmm.
carry. And that's a lot of learning, how to shape and craft these phrases, picking your moments where you give a lot more and picking the moments where you can pull back and where you can trust that the space will
Mm-hmm.
carry you, right? So I think it's been a lot of building that trust back, building the trust back in my own instrument, in my ability to shape my sound solely through my placement and my breath.
Mm-hmm.
And then also trusting the acoustic that I'm in and not feeling like I need to alter myself for the acoustic, allowing the acoustic to give to my sound what it's designed to, you
Mm-hmm.
know?
It's
Yeah.
there is going to be this massive relearning curve or learning curve for a lot of
Oh,
people,
huge. Oh, for sure.
for the
Hmm.
for the live performers like you, because not only is it a return to the bigger spaces with the better acoustic, but the second you put a live audience in there, again everything changes.
Changes.
and
Yep. Yep.
and that's not something you can practice with a lot. It's kind of, they're
No.
here and they're expecting good.
Yeah.
And
Yeah.
for the bedroom performers, for the new generation of pop musicians, rock musicians, that sort of stuff, transitioning to live performances, real live performances, not just streamed, is a huge learning curve. And I'm gonna do one more sort of question or one more thought area, and then, like, I've held you up for quite a long time, and this has been an absolutely amazing interview, and I want to do more because you're a great person to pick the brain of. You are predominantly, uh, uh, what did you call it? Classical music, CMC? No, that's not it. CCM.
CCM.
There we go.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're predominantly opera, CCM, that sort of stuff. But you have done. Uh-oh. Oh, you're still there. Yeah, good. You have done pop music, I guess, for lack of a better phrase. And what do you think about the two of them? And would you do more in the future? I guess is where I'm going to go with this.
Yeah. I mean, I'll say this first. There's definitely a problem in the classical world. It's getting better, but a problem with this idea that your voice should do one thing, that you should hone in on one style or one genre and really become a master of that one
Mm-hmm.
genre. And some people will do that and that will work for some people and that's great. But I think as a vocal artist, it's really important to explore all the different parts of your
Mm-hmm.
voice and to play with different styles and different genres and different ways that you can use your resonance. And that's really been really important for me, at least. Um, so yeah, pop specifically, I definitely don't sing a lot. I've dabbled around. I've done some things with friends and colleagues who've had opportunities that they've included me in. Um, yeah, I like it. It's definitely outside of my comfort zone. But I yeah, I think that I'm very open to doing other styles of gigging, performing opportunities like that when they arise. But yeah, I don't know. It's this. We kind of chatted about this before, but this kind of this idea of authenticity as a performer, finding um, yeah, like finding my own person on stage as an
Hmm.
individual has been yeah, just a bit more of a complicated journey for me. So I think that's probably why singing popular music or gigging is a little bit more intimidating for me. Another big part of it is that I'm predominantly a singer. I play piano too, but I wouldn't say I'm like a master at the piano. So if I were to gig with popular music, then I would need to find instrumentalists to perform with
Hmm.
me. Um, and that's also been made it more intimidating or daunting to venture into. But anyways, that's the whole my thoughts there.
Okay, no, and I think you touched on it. And it was something that we talked about, and I think it's a good place to end off this conversation with is it brings it all back to finding your own identity and stuff. But you're talking about people who want to tell you to just find your lane and stay in it. But the whole conversation, the big thing that I think I'd like to really highlight is you're talking about stretching yourself, pushing it a little bit
Yeah.
further. So I'm going to
Hmm.
give you. I'd like to give you just one last little chance to particularly the up and coming musicians, the one who are considering different paths. What would you say to them, or I guess to young Leslie as she's just getting started and finding her voice?
Yeah. Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it kind of touches back to what I was talking about when I talked about mentors, having this idea that you need someone better than you, someone higher up from you to tell you what to do, to tell you what you're good at. Again, this external validation, hearing someone say, "Oh, you're really great at singing this style." All of that influences what you think you're capable of. And that's great. You can take that information, you can learn from that, and that can become a part of your artistic identity for sure. But I also think it's really important to let all forms of music influence you and to experiment with different styles and experiment with your voice and using your voice in different ways. Like, for a classical musician, I know for a fact that classical musicians don't go home and listen to Chopin on repeat. Like, no way. They listen to so many other genres of music. They appreciate so many other genres of music, but they might not personally feel capable of performing or exploring that type of music for whatever
Mm-hmm.
reason. And that may have be because when they go to school and they mention to their prof that, "Oh, I think I'm going to audition for this musical theater show." And then their prof is like, "Oh my goodness, don't do that. You can't use your voice in that way." Like
Mm-hmm.
that sucks. That's discouraging. And so many of us have stories like that where we've performed something and someone's heard us and they've said it's bad or that we shouldn't use our voice that way or whatever it may be. I know for a fact every musician has a story
Mm-hmm.
like that. And it sucks, but you can't let that influence you. You have to, if you love to sing that way or if you're interested and want to learn to sing that way, then just try it. You can, and if it fails, then you'll learn something from
Mm-hmm.
that. But I'm very confident that it won't fail. I'm very confident that if you try to use your voice in different dynamic ways, that you're going to learn more about yourself as an artist, and it'll just be so enriching, to explore all these different types of music and how your voice can adapt to them uniquely. So I think that's super important.
And that
Yeah.
is the perfect place to end off on this. That is the right note to end off on. Oh, I'm sorry. All right, I really want to thank you for taking the time and having this conversation. Thank you for joining us here at Unbowed. Remember to smash that subscribe button, like the video, and give us a comment. We upload videos 3 times a week. This is interviews and footage from our concerts. If you like what we're doing here at Unbowed, please consider becoming a subscriber. This helps us produce more concerts, support the community, and shine spotlights on independent artists. Subscribers gain access to our full and unedited videos, full concert videos, and our Discord server, where a number of the artists that we work with hang out and chat.